Good afternoon and welcome to our panel session investigating how COVID-19 is impacting supply chains at Missouri companies. My name is George Zsidisin, and I serve as the director for the Supply Chain Risk and Resilience Research Institute. As you can see the logo behind me. I am the John W. Barriger Professor, as well as serve in the College of Business and in the Department of Supply Chain and Analytics. COVID-19 is arguably one of the most significant supply chain risks that we have encountered, or at least what I could remember within my lifetime. It seems almost every day that there's media stories explaining and describing how firms have had to deal with COVID-19 and their supply chains and the different ways they've had to be flexible. And I think about all of us here, it has affected each and every one of us. So today, the purpose of the panel session is to share knowledge, insight, and expertise in how COVID-19 is impacting supply chains in Missouri companies and what those supply chain professionals are doing to create resiliency in their operations and supply chains. So before we officially start the panel session and discussions, we would like to first recognize and thank the many individuals who have helped in creating this panel session for our students and constituents of the department and Umsl. First, I would like to recognize and thank Chancellor Kristen Sobolik, now officially our Chancellor, as well as our newly appointed Provost, Marie Mora, for their leadership and transparency during these challenging times. I have to say I've been very, very impressed. I've only been at Umsl for less than a year, but to see the level of engagement that they have with the community, with the students, the level of transparency, this is something I'm just very fortunate to be able to experience. Also, I'd like to recognize and thank Dean Charlie Hoffman and our Associate Deans, Joe Rotman and Michael Elliott, for leading the College of Business through these challenging times. We are very appreciative as well for our active departmental board. This is something that I very much treasured during my time here at Umsl, and the meetings that we've had. Unfortunately, we had a meeting very recently that had to be canceled due to COVID, but they've been consistently supportive of our department, of our students, and our college. And especially I would like to thank in advance our panelists for agreeing to participate and share their expertise and insight with us. We are very happy for their collaboration and work with us. I do also want to recognize and thank Professors Maureen Carrig and Dr. Jill Bracey for their continued work with our students, as well as Jennifer Downey, our student presidential club leader, for helping put this program together. And of course, I do want to say thank you to all of our students and the overall Umsl community, including, of course, our alumni for continued involvement and support. Our department, Supply Chain and Analytics, is very well positioned to serve a leadership role in studying the effects of COVID-19 in the supply chain and how firms can create resilience. In my opinion, I think this panel session is an example of some of the collaborative work that we are doing to really understand this phenomenon. And specifically, our research institute, Supply Chain Risk and Resilience Research Institute, we are creating a research agenda to investigate this. Professor Matthias Enz is with me, is in the process of applying for a National Science Foundation grant to study the supply chain practices during COVID-19. Further, we're also exploring creating and writing a book, compilating research and industry perspectives of how organizations have had to cope through this crisis. In addition, two of our professors, Professors James Campbell and Haitao Lee, with two of our PhD students, are examining vaccine delivery systems utilizing drone technology, which I think will be very important as we move forward in managing through this crisis. So today, we have a panel session of 4 esteemed business professionals sharing their insights with us. So in preparation, we asked them, after briefly introducing themselves, each panelist will have approximately 10 minutes to discuss their firm's processes for managing through this significant challenge in our supply chains. And specifically, we asked the panelists to prepare the remarks based upon three overarching themes. The first one is how COVID-19 has affected their operations and supply chains. Second, what their firms have done in response to COVID-19. And third, knowing what we know today, what would they have done differently, if anything, in preparing for the COVID-19 pandemic? So during the session today, we will go in order of the announcement, which will be started by Mr. Ty Lindhorst of Ameren, followed by Jaya Subramanian from Express Scripts. Then Mr. Brett Caplice from Bungee will provide his perspectives, followed by Mr. Chris Miller from the Hub Group. After the panelist presentations are finished, we will have approximately 10, well, a little bit longer, 15 to 20 minutes of a question and answer session. And so for all of the people who are participating in this session, please at the appropriate time, ask your questions through the question and answer button that you would find on Zoom. So after the questions and answer, we will have a short wrap up, providing just a summary of the insights provided by our panelists after the questions and answers. So very much looking forward to hearing the insights of our supply chain professionals and our esteemed board members. So Mr. Lindhorst, would you mind starting and getting things beginning for the panel, please?
Yes, absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it, being included into this type of engagement. So my name is Ty Lindhorst. I'm a Director of Supply Chain Operations at Ameren, located in downtown St. Louis. We're the utility here that's providing gas and power to 1.2 million customers in Illinois and about the same number in Missouri. So how has COVID-19 affected your firm's operations and supply chain? Well, it's greatly disrupted it, right? I mean, I never thought I would spend as much time as I have trying to acquire PPE for our field workers. But I think the first step in risk mitigation when we think about the utility, it's about the stability of the grid and us being able to maintain that, should it be from a storm coming through or a gas leak or just normal operations from running a plant to produce the electricity. So we have to cover a lot of different bases, and we have to think about a lot of different situations that our coworkers go into. So first and foremost, safety is foundational at Ameren, and getting the right PPE into the company it has been and still is very challenging. We use different face coverings and masks to do our work, and there's respirators out there, and a respirator protects our coworkers by filtering particulates out by 95%. So if we have to enter a home where there's a COVID positive case, we're giving our Ameren coworkers the right PPE to enter that house and check for gas leaks and do what we need to do in there and protect them. The other, I think the other big aspect is social distancing and trying to stay the 6 feet apart where possible is, I think, our first line of protection. And so with that, we used to have, prior to COVID-19, we used to have a lot of folks show up to what we call our operating centers, and we would have a safety, talk briefing to start the day, talk about the jobs they're going to do that day. Now we broke those groups into much smaller. So from a supply chain perspective, we created an additional 30 trailers full of our material that we could have, and we rented trailers and put them out in the field and created an additional reporting locations. That way we could maintain social distancing and have fewer people show up at our operating centers. I think that is one of the big benefits. We've also adjusted our schedules, looking to more 12-hour shifts and trying to keep like a group A and a group B from overlapping and meeting one another. That way, if someone on that team did test positive or needed to be quarantined for a period of time, it wouldn't take out the entire, say, for example, warehouse team, and we could still maintain operations at that point. We also thought about folks, how they come into our warehouses and we receive items. And because in the beginning, when we first started, some of the quarantine questions we would ask people is, where have you been, in the last 14 days? And so if you was at a hot spot, like a California or Chicago, we added, then we would say, hey, we'd ask you not to come on Ameren property. But with delivery drivers, it creates a different aspect because it's just very hard to maintain and know where everyone's been. And so we put up additional facilities and locations for people to, the drivers, when they pull in, and so they're coming to get out of their truck and unsecure their loads, and we ask them to sit back in their truck, and that we started advanced shipping notices where we're not signing documents anymore. And in particular cases where we have to, we try and prevent that from happening altogether. So we put a lot of things in place to try and create social distancing and to create a lot of separation. And then when you cannot maintain that social distancing, then we provide in the PPE, hand sanitizer, and the masks, gloves, and then a lot of disinfectant wipes. We have a lot of folks that work out in the field, and so soap and water is not readily available, and so hand sanitizer is the preferred method. And as you can imagine, I'm sure everyone experienced it, you couldn't buy a bottle of hand sanitizer for a lot of days. And so we were very challenged in that regard on buying that. We were buying from distilleries and buying from any location we could really find and trying to push that product out in the field. And we were into a situation where we're doing a lot of spot buys. And now we're getting to the point, we're about 8 weeks into this, and that we've been working from home and put our what we call our area command team in place. And we had just now starting to get some business continuity of our supply and being able to get regular deliveries of hand sanitizer and our face coverings, examination masks, respirators, even thermometers. We put in where we're doing health screenings before you come to work, and we're asking people to take their temperature and answer a few questions, because if you're sick and when you feel sick, we don't want you coming to work. And so just even the difficulty of the supply chain on everyone went out and bought thermometers. And so we needed about 500 of them, and we're still waiting on at least 200 of them. We've got about 300 in. We're trying to put them out of all our reporting locations so people can take their temperature before they come to work and or during the work, and go home if they feel sick. So those are some of the challenges we face. A lot of the things we've done a lot of supplier communications. We started a bi-weekly cadence with our suppliers and trying to understand their plans for business continuity and what difficulties COVID-19 caused them. We've done 4 rounds to date. We've communicated with over 2,000 of our suppliers and identified and kind of ranked them into buckets from a high, medium, low risk profile. And so we're currently monitoring all of them. And then from a business continuity, besides the PPE, we also increased our inventory levels by probably 15 to 20%. And we pushed a lot of inventory. We kind of had a hub and spoke model for distribution. And we pushed, what we ended up doing is created about 10 more stocking warehouses. That way, if one of the major warehouses ended up having to be quarantined for a COVID-19 positive test, we still had a lot of material in the field for our coworkers to be able to respond to any of the ongoing work, and that was certainly important to Ameren to maintain our ongoing work, and then any storm-related or emergency type work from an either electric or gas perspective. And so I think those are very key on doing that and increasing your inventory, and it gives you that cushion that you need in your supply chain when you have a disruption. And then we're just trying to maintain our day-to-day sourcing activities and continue to, we have contracts expiring, coming due all the time. And so just trying to maintain the normal work was already a full-time job before we put all this stuff on there. And I think one of the early challenges we had is that, when you have a shared services model as we do for supply chain, there's a lot of folks that work in a centralized location, and getting them out of what we call our general office building and pushed to their homes and be able to get them up and running and being productive was certainly a challenge. Getting all the right equipment, computer equipment, getting Skype to work. Even today, we're not using Zoom because it's not approved from our cybersecurity perspective. But it's, Skype and Teams meetings and getting everybody used to being on the phone, I think a little bit more has certainly been a challenge in the beginning. And I think my final question is, knowing what you know today, what we've done differently. And I think there's really three key things we would have done differently. We would have transitioned to home sooner. I think we probably should have done that a couple weeks earlier, because it's worked out well once we got everybody up and running, and it's proven that we have not a whole lot of COVID-19 positive cases within Ameren, so that's a good thing. I would have purchased more PPE earlier. We started placing orders in February. We got our team together in middle of January. We started talking about the coronavirus, and we didn't know the supply chain. For example, I talked about the thermometers on the respirators, on the hand sanitizer, on the Clorox, Lysol wipes. All those things are very hard to get, and we probably should have started placing orders earlier. And I think finally, pushing the inventory out into the field for us is a big deal, because if we don't have the stuff to be able to do our work, we can't. And in our current, hub and spoke model for our distribution centers, getting the material out sooner and raising those inventory levels, overall goals to probably push about $15 million out to the field and have it readily available. So I think we would have done that sooner if we given the chance. So I'll pause there and see if there's any questions, or I know we're saving them to the end, but see if the moderator has anything.
Oh, no, Ty, that is absolutely perfect. Thank you very much. To be fair, for all the panelists, we'll leave the questions till the very end. So for all those other people participating, please be patient. I want to make sure everyone has the opportunity to share their insights. Jaya, would you mind going next, please?
Not at all. Again, thank you so much for providing me this opportunity to share some of the experiences that we had with COVID-19. I'm more an expert of the supply chain, so I'm just going to share more details into how the COVID had impacted the supply chain more than the operations, because that is an entirely a different set of people. So from a supply chain perspective, Express Scripts, apart from being a pharmaceutical benefits manager, we also operate 4 really big home delivery pharmacies. And a lot of volume goes through those home delivery pharmacies. So definitely, we have seen some impact. So pharma supply chain is global by nature. So we have, and you have been reading this in the news. It's been the key discussion in Washington, D.C. Yes, a lot of the materials, especially in the raw materials, do come from across the world. It's not just one place, but it's just across the world. Supply raw materials and the finished goods come from China, they come from Europe, they come from Israel, they come from East European countries, and of course, a lot of them are also manufactured in United States itself. And since it's a worldwide pandemic, so every part of the world was impacted, so every place where the pharma supply chain is located was also impacted. One of the best things, or maybe one of the silver lining in this dark cloud, is that in almost every part of the world where this pandemic has taken hold, pharma is still considered an essential services. So they have continued to operate, or they have allowed to be continued to operate. So that has definitely reduced the impact to a certain extent compared to non-essential industries. But at the same time, again, nobody is spared. So despite that they're essential services, they have been, the pharma companies, whether they're raw material suppliers or the final finished dose, they all have been operating at less than what they usually operate. So they are on an average between 50 to 70% of their capacity. The other big thing, and that's mainly because there are restrictions to the movement of people, there's restriction to movement of goods and services between the countries and even within the countries. The second biggest piece that has impacted, that COVID has impacted, and most probably that is a bigger impact, is the logistics piece. So absolutely, because it's global, the materials have to travel from country A to country B, and even within the countries, from different regions to certain, seaports and airports. And as if you've seen, as the lockdowns have continued, a lot of times the international travel has been curtailed. And so there's not flights that are going between different countries. The same thing with on the sea ports. While the sea shipments have not necessarily been curtailed, the people that operate at the ports have been severely restrained, again, because of the quarantine and, of course, the different quarantine and lockdown effects that are taken by the different parts of the world. So it's not been consistent. So, of course, there's different levels of disruption in different parts of the world, which has resulted in a very odd thing of containers being at places where they're not needed and no containers being available in the places that are needed. So logistics is one of the biggest hits. So even if the materials are available, there has been pretty much of a greater impact of getting those goods moved from one place to another, which of course results in, again, lower capacity, but depletion of safety stocks, and of course, the increase in price because the freight costs have gone up significantly. So that is the overall impact that we are seeing. So they're traveling slowly. The ultimate medications are traveling slowly from across the world, but they're still flowing. There's no stoppage, so to speak. The third impact is, of course, us being pharmacies, is all the different drugs that are being used to treat COVID. So every couple of weeks, we hear about, oh, this drug is really working, and that drug is really working. And a lot of these drugs are not only being used to treat COVID, but they're used in the normal life, in the normal world. They're used to treat a lot of life-altering conditions. For example, hydroxychloroquine, which was in the news for a very long time. It is not only, yes, it was being, researched as a potential treatment for COVID, but it was also used to treat some life-altering conditions like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. So the other drug was albuterol. So again, yes, it was used in the hospitals for COVID treatment, but it's also used for pretty life-altering conditions if you have allergies and asthma, for the sudden attacks of those types of situations, they're also used. So what happens is when there is, due to this pandemic, all these types of drugs have a huge surge in demand in a very short period of time. In any kind of a supply chain, even if it's not drug related, none of the supply chains can actually quickly react to such sudden surges of demand. So definitely that has had some impact to how do we manage these kinds of quick and a large surge in demand as the world continues to find treatments for this pandemic. So those are the three big impacts from a COVID perspective that is happening on the supply chain of the drugs. The second question was, okay, what did we do to manage or mitigate this kind of impact that arises from COVID-19? So one of the benefits of being in the pharma world is that in the past we have seen nothing like this pandemic, but we have seen worldwide disruptions of certain classes of drugs. Nothing like this massive, but definitely some classes of drugs. So at Express Scripts, we had seen this 6-7 years ago. There are certain classes of drugs, be it doxycycline or atorvastatin and things like that. So we had already developed and put in place a fairly robust risk mitigation strategy to take into account and to mitigate the impact of such worldwide impact that actually happened in fairly short period of time. And we'll have to move and mitigate and evaluate in a very short period of time too. So we had already a really robust risk mitigation, risk evaluation program in place, and we've had the experience of evaluating and mitigating such risk in a very short period of time. For example, in the last 2 years, we have been mitigating risks related to, or worldwide risk related to, a class of drugs known as sartans, which had impurities. In the last few months, we have seen Zantac and all those associated drugs also having the similar kinds of worldwide impact. So our risk mitigation was very robust. The way our mitigation process works is that we have very sophisticated monitoring services which pick up these things as soon as it hits in any one part of the world. So as soon as the pandemic hit, even before it was a pandemic, when it hit China in January, we immediately picked it up, and within about a week or so, we have already evaluated the risk and started our mitigation process. And as the pandemic slowly moved across the world, we just continue to repeat that same process. It's like rinse and repeat. And we also had our playbook in terms of, okay, once the risk is identified, evaluated, then the mitigation playbook comes into play. And then we are able to move at very, very, very quick pace to put all these three things one after the other, like clockwork. So that actually helped significantly, at least our pharmacies, because we were able to move ahead of the market. We were able to secure the supply ahead of the market. We knew how much we were able to evaluate how long potentially we could think that disruption would be. Again, this was a pandemic, so we still believe that we have better estimates than others, but again, it's the jury's still out. But we were able to estimate the level of disruption and what it would take for us to mitigate the disruption ultimately, so that we can minimize any kind of supply disruption to our patients. As of today, we are kind of very proud to say that our patients have hardly seen any disruption from any of the three impacts that I just talked about, and we continue to do the same thing. We are not necessarily stopping at all, so we're still continuing to monitor very closely. We have deep relationships with our suppliers. That is a part of our risk mitigation, so they know what we are doing and what our processes are. So they work very well with our processes, and we are constantly in touch with our different manufacturers across the world to understand what their situation is, and then work with them to put these different mitigation strategies in place. So that's what we have done to mitigate. Again, we cannot eliminate the risk, but we have tried to minimize the disruption as much as possible. The last question was what we would do differently. Definitely, we did not anticipate such a pandemic. So one of the first things we would definitely do is to create a playbook, create a playbook to mitigate these kinds of pandemics in the future. So what we have done is we are repeating it, but I think these kinds of pandemics would need a slightly different playbook that would be even more effective than what we have done today. So that is definitely one of the things we are already starting to work on, so that we will continue to do so. And that we would do by analyzing the lessons learned. What did we do right? What went right? And what could we learn from the challenges that we faced and we are still facing? Is a way that we can mitigate those things. And one of the things that, as a part of mitigating, is so right now we were still reacting, but we're reacting very fast. So and we had already started on this process, but our future would be to have more of a proactive reaction. Well, that's not the right word, but more of a proactive action, let me say. And we're actually working with Umsl's team to develop a predictive analytical models. And that's what we would do going forward to continue to develop that and using machine language, artificial intelligence, data mining to ensure that we can start predicting some of these things a little bit ahead and not continue to react. So those are some of the things that we definitely would do differently, and of course, increase our the way that we work with increase the closeness and the relationship with our vendors even more closer than what we are, to make it a more symbiotic relationship. I think all those strategies we hope will really help next time hopefully we don't see a pandemic like that, but if we do see something like that, that we're very well prepared for it. So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Jaya. Very insightful. Well, first, I know all four of them are going to be very insightful, so thank you so much. Brett, would you mind sharing some of your insights with our students and constituents?
Sure. Can you hear me okay? Good. So I don't have as much of a prepared 10 minutes. I kind of just made a few notes about the 3 questions you gave me, so I'll kind of talk to them and hopefully leave it open for questions at the end. But so I guess I'll start with Bungee. For those of you who don't know, we're an agriculture company. So in the general sense of it, we buy grain from farmers, we put it into big bins, we put it on barges, we put it on vessels, we send it to China, we send it to India, Bangladesh, wherever. We also take some grain and we process it here in the US. We produce soybean oil and soybean meal. Soybean meal feeds basically chickens and hogs. Soybean oil fries French fries and chips and everything you need for the snack food business. So that's our general business. So I guess our experience about COVID so far has probably been a little bit different than others because same with some others, we were deemed pretty early on an essential business. We are the food supply chain. We're a big part of the food supply chain. So we had always been designated that by the Department of Homeland Security. So we knew that going in. We knew we weren't going to have as many disruptions. The biggest thing that happened to us was how quick certain of our demand sectors changed. So for instance, on the soybean oil side, so we sell probably 40% of our oil goes to what we call food service. So that's McDonald's, Chick-fil-A, Quick Trip, your restaurant down the street, whoever needs to fry something. And the speed in which that declined shocked us. Similarly, when we sell, the other 60% of our oil goes to somebody like Kraft or a ConAgra, somebody who makes Doritos, Frito-Lay, snack food. So what we consider kind of a center of the grocery store thing. So, you know, the outside of the grocery store has your milk and your eggs and your vegetables and fruit. The interior, the inside of the grocery store has your chips and your granola bars, anything that's highly processed. Center of the grocery store stuff in the first 2 weeks, 3 weeks sold out. People were buying non-perishable foods. So as we were looking at this, we saw one demand sector go to 0 in 2 weeks, and one demand sector the other demand sector go up 50%, 70% within 2 weeks. So for us, the total demand pie, it probably stayed about the same, but it shifted dramatically in where it went. And how we dealt with that, it was a very big learning curve about how subtle differences in orders can mean huge ramifications to the supply chain. So, you know, we sell the exact same product to, I guess, Cisco. Cisco is a big company that serves McDonald's, Quick Trip, whoever. They buy the exact same product. This is a Kraft or a ConAgra, somebody makes chips. They take it in a different form. So Cisco takes it in smaller packages that might be 35 pounds. ConAgra takes it in trucks or rail cars. So all of a sudden your need for packaging supplies goes way up because now you have to divide up that rail car, that truck into 100 or 1,000 packages to be able to give it to the other customer. So the exact same product going to generally the same use, which is food, now needs many, many times more packaging. So that was a learning curve for us. And how quickly we had to learn that was a surprise. So I guess my other notes were, so I guess that's on the food side. The other parts that we saw how it affected us was safety was huge. So we knew early on that we were an essential business. Most of our facilities, just think where grain is grown, is rural. So it's the Farm Belt. It's Iowa, Indiana, Missouri, Ohio, Nebraska, South Dakota. So we didn't have a huge risk. We didn't have a huge perceived risk of actual COVID reaching to our plants. It wasn't New York. It wasn't Seattle. We were rural areas. That said, dealing with fear was a pretty big curve for us. So how do you talk to somebody in Aberdeen, South Dakota, and say, hey, your job's essential. You need to go into the grain elevator. Your partner, your wife, husband might be working at, I don't know, it's the computer shop. They're working at home, but you have to go in. You have to deal with that risk. So we had a lot of weeks talking about, is hazard pay a thing? Should we pay somebody an extra $4 an hour or $7 an hour or a bonus? Do we have to print them a letter in case they get pulled over by the police? So we have grain facilities in Illinois. When the stay-at-home order went into effect, there was a real risk that people would be pulled over by the police. We had people who lived in Illinois and work in Missouri. So were they going to leave their homes and be pulled over on their way into Missouri to be quarantined while they go to their essential jobs? So there were some of those concerns that were pretty big for us. We even had a few cases where people lied about testing positive for COVID. So we had a few times when people wanted to be home and they told us they were exposed or they told us they had a positive test. And there were a few ethical dilemmas of, health information, health data, health concerns. It's a private matter. So if somebody tells you that they have corona or COVID, can you compel them to give you a test? Can you compel them to take a test? So contact tracing was very iffy or very tough for us to get through. I would say the way we dealt with it is we had daily management calls for, I guess, the first 5 weeks of this. They actually only ended last week, trying to deal with these problems, figure out the best way to go about them. Had to rely on a lot of government websites and talking to local mayors and county managers to try to figure out the best way to deal with it. But I would say the personnel issues on this were huge. We also operate barge lines. So here in St. Louis, load a barge, take it down to New Orleans. And you don't really think about it. You see the barges go, but it takes 7 to 8 days for a barge from St. Louis to get to New Orleans. And there's a boat that's driving that. And those guys are on the boat the whole time. So they live, sleep, eat on that boat. So all of a sudden, what you think is a very labor unintensive job, a big barge, becomes very labor confined. So you had people in small spaces. What happens if somebody was sick on a boat when they get on board in St. Louis, and you don't know until 8 days later when they're in New Orleans, and all of a sudden the whole ship is contaminated. So we had a few of those issues. And I guess the other one I was thinking of is government intervention has become the name of the game for us too. So as we were navigating this, as we were becoming an essential business, we saw these CARES Acts getting passed. In agriculture specifically, they gave another $23 billion to producers. So we're seeing more money flood into the market that I would say is not necessarily market driven or market force driven. And so agriculture is one of the historic commodity markets. Commodity markets are, I guess, live and breathe on transparency and liquidity and, having a clear bid and offer all the way down the curve. You know what your risk is, you know how to hedge your risk. And, when you have intervention in the markets, it gets a lot harder to manage that risk. So we've seen that on the producer side, that farmers now, or in the last 2 weeks, I think they've planted 58% of their corn crop. They planted a third or a quarter of their soybean crop. I didn't look at the numbers exactly today. But so they're producing or they're planting crops now, not really understanding what's going to happen with demand. So are we as a country or a world, are we going to go to the same amount of restaurants next November that we did last November? So are we going to eat as much? Are we going to consume as much calories? They're making that decision today. The government's giving them money to make that decision. So one way we looked at it, I think the amount of money that the government paid the farmers this year could buy a full crop worth of soybeans for the year. So the government just paid for a full year's worth of what the farmers are going to plant for soybeans. So does that encourage them to produce more? It could. And what happens next year if we're all not going to the same amount of restaurants? Does crops spoil? Do we have to burn more of it because we use it for fuel? Is that necessarily what we want to be doing? Do you put these weird incentives in the market? And similarly to that, the big thing in the news the last probably 2 weeks, at least in our industry, has been these meat plants that have been closed. So we are the biggest, or one of the biggest suppliers to most people who you get your bacon from, or your chicken tenders or your chicken breast from the supermarket. And what we've seen from them is maybe not what you'd expect. So I saw the headline today from Costco. So Costco is now limiting how much meat you can buy. So if you were to talk to somebody, a pork producer in Iowa, and said, hey, why is Costco limiting how much pork I can buy? They would say, availability of pigs isn't the problem. And I have pictures on my phone that show, quarter mile long piles of dead hogs, euthanized piglets that these guys, they have the hogs, they can't get them to the kill plants. So truckers aren't available to work. We've seen the cases in South Dakota where there's 570 people test positive in a single kill plant. That single kill plant has 10 or 15% of the total hog population that kills goes to that plant. So we have a super consolidated supply chain. We have a super just-in-time supply chain. So when one of those plants goes down, everything backs up behind it. And so if you have a hog that's been on feed for 200 days or whatever, and all of a sudden your local plant won't take it, you don't have a choice other than to euthanize it or to get rid of it. So we have the food, we're producing it, but because of the nature of how just in time our supply chain is, any small disruption is really breaking things down. So I guess we were decently prepared, or we had a good idea what was going to happen coming into it. The violence of the moves have been shocking to us. So we just didn't think it would be as volatile as it would be, or as it's proven to be. So I think I went through probably the first two questions. I guess the third one, knowing what you know today, what would you have done differently? I guess there's probably two big things, or two big lessons learned. So Bungee, we're a very big global company. We have offices and grain processing plants in China and Europe and South America and the Middle East. And I'm surprised looking back how much we were still caught off guard, even though our own colleagues in Shanghai and Beijing were working from home for 2 months. So we came into this year for the Chinese New Year, and they were telling us, man, we're at home, we're locked down, we can't do anything. And we knew it. We had firsthand information from our own colleagues across the ocean, and we still didn't believe it would happen in the US. So I guess I would say listening to our own information, or trying to find that signal through the noise a little bit better, is probably something we would do differently. And the other one is probably the flip side of that same coin. Because we were a little bit more international, we were making moves to cut travel, to shut our office down probably before others were. And I know our head of HR was on a call with other St. Louis area HR directors, and she got off the call, I want to say this was probably like March 25th, so maybe a week after it got really bad. And she said, guys, I am shocked how many St. Louis area businesses haven't done anything. Haven't bought masks, haven't bought hand sanitizer, haven't bought thermometers, just all think it's going to blow over. And for us, we had been in it for 2 or 3 weeks. We had already shut down the office. We had already instituted temperature checks at all of our plants, and we had thought that was the norm. So I would say community outreach is something we would have done a little bit sooner, to share that information we had from the international community, probably a little bit more locally. We thought other people were getting that information at the same time we were, and I think that was wrong. So I guess listening to our international more and dispensing that information locally quicker would probably be the two biggest lessons learned. I don't know if that was 10 minutes or not, but I think I probably covered most of my notes.
Oh, that was very good. Thank you very much, Brett.
Yep.